If you are a fan of horror films that explore not only the supernatural but also the psychological, The Exorcism, 2024, has a lot to offer. Directed by Joshua John Miller, the film blends classic elements of demonic possession with a deep analysis of human trauma, creating a storyline that leads us to question the thin line between fiction and reality. The story follows Anthony Miller, portrayed by Russell Crowe, a middle-aged man marked by a dark past of addiction and personal tragedies. After the death of his wife, he finds himself in a constant battle with alcoholism and drug addiction. His chance for redemption arises when he is invited to play the role of a priest in a horror film about exorcisms titled The Georgetown Project. For Anthony, this role seems like an opportunity to revive his career and escape his old demons, but he will soon discover that much darker forces are at play. The film opens with a tension that grows as the story progresses. Anthony, already vulnerable due to his addictions and losses, begins to exhibit increasingly strange behavior during the film's production. What starts as a simple performance turns into something far more disturbing. He begins to show signs of demonic possession. His aggression escalates, and his behavior becomes unpredictable and even supernatural. The line between what is real and what is fiction begins to blur, and the confusion becomes palpable, both for Anthony and the audience. Meanwhile, Anthony's daughter Lee, played by Samantha Mathis, watches with growing concern as her father's behavior changes. After years of estrangement due to his addictions, she begins to fear the worst, worrying that what appeared to be a relapse into Anthony's old vices might, in fact, be something far more serious and supernatural. With the support of her friend Blake, played by Chloe Bailey, Lee decides to investigate what is truly happening with her father. The film takes the viewer on a profound emotional and psychological journey, exploring not only demonic possession, but also the devastating effects of unresolved trauma. Throughout the plot, we discover that Anthony not only battled a life of addiction, but also suffered deep childhood traumas, including sexual abuse. These events, compounded by the recent loss of his wife, contribute to the complexity of his transformation. What seemed like a simple return to acting becomes a distorted mirror of his own internal struggle. When Anthony is finally overtaken by a demonic force, the exorcism becomes inevitable. Father Connor, played by David Hyde Pierce, is called to perform the ritual, and it is at this moment that the film draws closer to classic elements of the genre, such as religious rituals and the battle between good and evil. The tension mounts, and we see Lee and Blake doing everything they can to save Anthony, while facing not only the demonic presence, but also their own internal conflicts. However, the film takes an unexpected turn when it is revealed that the demon possessing Anthony is not a traditional supernatural being, but a monster created specifically for the film within the film. This raises questions about the artistic process and the creation of myths. This twist, introducing the concept of a fictional demon coming to life, is both intriguing and somewhat forced, causing the film to lose some of its narrative cohesion. Instead of delving into the spiritual depths of possession or the mysteries of evil, the film opts for a more metaphorical approach, blending the supernatural with a critique of the film industry. While the film manages to create moments of tension, the exorcism itself becomes predictable, and the conclusion, though not devoid of emotion, leaves a sense of a rushed and somewhat anticlimactic ending. The final battle against the demon feels forced, as if the narrative is trying to wrap up quickly what had been built throughout the story, leaving important questions unanswered. The film, which seemed to promise a deep analysis of the psychological traumas of its protagonist, ends up losing its way. The Exorcism, however, stands out for its focus on psychological horror. It doesn't simply aim to scare the audience with supernatural scenes, but also explores the devastating consequences of an unresolved past. The father-daughter relationship is the emotional core of the film, with Lee fighting to understand what has happened to her father, while also trying to save what's left of her family. Anthony's psychological drama is moving, and Russell Crowe's performance is undoubtedly one of the film's highlights, masterfully conveying the suffering and internal struggle of his character. However, the introduction of subplots that are not fully explored, such as Lee's relationship with Blake, ends up undermining the cohesion of the story. These elements could have been used to deepen the plot further, but are treated superficially, which leaves the film with an uneven pace. Anthony's story is so rich in emotional potential that it ultimately overshadows these subplots, which become mere secondary details in the narrative. On a general analysis, The Exorcism is a film that starts with an interesting premise but fails in its execution. The blend of psychological horror and the supernatural could have been better explored, and the concept of a fictional demon becoming real, while creative, isn't fully convincing. The film's pace is slow, which may displease some viewers, and the ending, while satisfying in some aspects, leaves the sense that the film could have been more impactful. However, Russell Crowe's performance and the attempt to delve into deep psychological themes ensure that The Exorcism is a horror experience that, while not terrifying, brings to light issues of grief, trauma, and a man's inner struggle with his own demons. The film doesn't quite reach classic status within the genre, but certainly offers a reflection on the inner monsters we all carry and the invisible scars that shape us. In the end, The Exorcism is a tale of psychological horror, but also a character study and a meditation on how life and art can intertwine in unexpected ways. However, it is undeniable that The Exorcism attempts something that few horror films dare to do: take the viewer beyond the momentary shock and supernatural tension, touching on deeper psychological themes. The concept of a film within a film is an interesting approach, raising the idea that art and life are inextricably linked. The very nature of the exorcism within the plot raises a metaphor about Anthony's internal struggle and his search for redemption and purification from his own personal demons. Art, in this case, is a reflection of reality and, paradoxically, also a vehicle to confront the traumas that shape the protagonist's life. But, at the same time, this idea is not fully explored, making the film ambiguous, leaving a sense of frustration in the air. This frustration becomes even more evident when we think about the film's climax, which arrives with an expectation of resolution, but delivers a solution that, while satisfactory, is also shallow. The Exorcism, although it carries the typical elements of the genre, the battle between the forces of good and evil, the use of religious rituals, and the presence of a priest as the central figure of resistance, ends up feeling somewhat generic and predictable. The film presents us with an exorcism where the tension builds, but the final outcome leaves the sense that, rather than an emotional peak, we are watching a merely procedural conclusion. There is a kind of anticlimax, where the final battle is resolved so hastily that the viewer barely has time to process everything that happened before. This is particularly noticeable when we look at the treatment of Anthony's character. The film's attempt to showcase the internal struggle of a man who no longer knows whether he's facing a real possession or merely a psychological breakdown is valid, but not entirely successful. The way the film blends the two elements, the psychological and the supernatural, is interesting, but it ends up leaving the viewer confused at times, unsure where one ends and the other begins. The protagonist himself, who is the key to the plot, seems to fluctuate between moments of clarity and possession, which removes the clarity from his journey and makes it difficult for the audience to genuinely connect with him. The father-daughter relationship could also have been explored more, as it is the emotional heart of the narrative. Lee, with her own insecurities and wounds, is constantly trying to find a way to connect with her father, while also being forced to confront him as someone very different from the man she once knew. This emotional tension between them, however, ends up being somewhat superficial, as the film doesn't delve deeply enough into the family dynamics. This is reflected in the way Lee's character is treated. Her relationship with Blake, for instance, is pushed to the background, and there is no true exploration of how her sexuality could influence her relationship with her father, or even how she deals with internal conflicts in a fragmented family environment. These subplots are not fully developed and end up diluting the impact of the main narrative. The film also falters by not offering a deeper reflection on the creative process and the role of art in shaping our perception of reality. The metaphor the film attempts to build, the idea that the Exorcism film and Anthony's personal struggles are symbolically connected, is intriguing but ultimately unfulfilled. Instead, the story becomes a vehicle for suspense that is not sufficiently developed. The concept of a demon created for the film coming to life could be fascinating at first glance, but in the end, it feels more like an excuse for a twist that isn't well explained, one that fails to deliver the impact it promised. In terms of performances, however, there are notable highs. Russell Crowe, as always, delivers a solid and convincing performance, bringing intense emotional depth to the character. His portrayal of a man marked by vices and traumas, confronted by something beyond his control, is undoubtedly one of the film's strengths. He manages to convey his character's pain in a raw and realistic way, which helps sustain the psychological drama that permeates the story. On the other hand, Samantha Mathis's performance, while effective, doesn't possess the same depth. Lee's character, as mentioned, could have been more thoroughly explored, and the actress doesn't have much room to shine, making the father-daughter relationship less impactful than it could have been. In terms of cinematography, the film opts for a more sober and restrained style, which aligns with the psychological tone of the story. The photography, in the more tense moments, is dark and often claustrophobic, reflecting the protagonist's mental state. The possession scenes, in turn, are constructed with effects that do not aim for immediate shock, but rather focus on the gradual creation of an atmosphere of discomfort and anxiety. While Joshua John Miller's direction succeeds in creating an unsettling mood, the film falters in executing key moments, especially during the confrontations between good and evil, which feel rather forgettable. The music, composed to heighten the tension, is effective, but doesn't stand out as anything innovative within the genre. By the end, the narrative fades somewhat from the viewer's memory, and the film doesn't leave as strong a mark as other psychological horror classics. In summary, The Exorcism is a film that raises more questions than answers, failing to fully explore the potential of its premise. The fusion of psychological horror and the supernatural is an interesting attempt, but not entirely successful, leaving the impression that the film could have delved deeper into the themes it proposes. The result is a film that, despite its merits, fails to become a standout work within the genre. With a slower pace than many would prefer, a predictable climax, and a storyline that loses itself in unresolved subplots, The Exorcism ultimately becomes an experience that leaves the viewer with the sense that the film didn't reach its full potential. However, for those seeking a reflection on human nature, the struggle against one's own demons, and the consequences of an unresolved past, the film offers something beyond conventional horror, even if not as impactful as it could have been. Despite its flaws in execution, The Exorcism raises interesting discussions about how we face trauma and the complexity of human nature. One of the film's greatest strengths is its attempt to humanize the protagonist, Anthony, by exploring how his internal struggles manifest in almost tangible ways. He is a character full of nuances, representing the constant battle between the desire for redemption and the overwhelming force of his past. Throughout the film, we see Anthony not only as a victim of a possible demonic possession, but also as someone fighting not to be consumed by his own guilt and regrets. The narrative, however, suffers from indecision between being a character study and a supernatural thriller. This ambiguity, which could have been a strong point if handled well, ultimately becomes a problem as it leaves many aspects of the plot underdeveloped. For example, the origin of the demon possessing Anthony is only superficially addressed. The revelation that the demon is a fictional creation within the film feels more like an underexplored idea than a cohesive narrative decision. This approach could have been a powerful metaphor about the boundaries between art and reality, but instead, it feels rushed and disconnected from the rest of the plot. The relationship between Lee and Anthony is another aspect that could have been explored more deeply. The father-daughter bond is undoubtedly one of the most emotional layers of the film, but its execution is limited. Lee is clearly a character with her own wounds and insecurities, yet the script does not allow her to have a truly meaningful arc. Her attempt to save her father reflects her desire to reconnect emotionally with him. But in the end, the relationship between the two does not undergo any real evolution. This causes the emotional core of the film, which should serve as the foundation for the viewer's connection with the story, to lose some of its strength. Moreover, the choice to include Lee's relationship with Blake, while interesting as a representation of diversity, ends up becoming an almost decorative detail in the narrative. This subplot is not meaningfully integrated into the main story and does not contribute to the development of the central themes. In a film that already struggles with balancing its elements, This superficial inclusion comes off more as an attempt to meet contemporary demands for inclusion rather than an organic part of the plot. On the technical side, The Exorcism shows moments of brilliance, especially in its cinematography. The art direction and production design are well executed, with sets that reflect the claustrophobic nature of the narrative. The scenes depicting Anthony's possession are carefully crafted to evoke a sense of discomfort and tension without resorting excessively to easy scares. The film's color palette, dominated by dark tones and shadows, helps create an oppressive atmosphere that matches the protagonist's emotional state. Lighting in particular is used effectively to highlight the most intense moments, with play of light and shadow that helps convey the duality between the real and the supernatural. The soundtrack, while not particularly memorable, serves its purpose by intensifying moments of tension and creating an atmosphere of unease. It does not attempt to dominate the scenes, but rather complements them, which is a sensible choice for a film that focuses more on psychological drama than on traditional horror elements. Still, a more striking musical theme could have helped solidify the film's identity. When it comes to performances, Russell Crowe is undoubtedly the highlight. He brings an emotional depth to the character of Anthony that elevates the material he works with. His portrayal of a broken man battling his own demons while facing a supernatural threat is convincing and engaging. He manages to convey both the vulnerability and intensity of Anthony, making him a tragic figure that the audience can connect with, despite the script's shortcomings. Samantha Mathis also delivers a solid performance as Lee, but, as mentioned earlier, the lack of character development limits the impact of her portrayal. Supporting actors, such as David Hyde Pierce in the role of Father Connor, fulfill their functions well, but they don't have enough material to shine. One issue that deserves attention is how the film addresses themes of trauma and guilt. While the execution is not always successful, it is clear that The Exorcism attempts to go beyond the genre's cliches by exploring the effects of past experiences on the human psyche. Anthony is haunted not only by supernatural forces but also by his own memories and regrets. This approach adds an extra layer of complexity to the film, even though it is not fully explored. The script could have delved deeper into how these elements interconnect, but it is still interesting to see a horror film attempting to address emotional and psychological issues in a serious manner. However, for those looking for a traditional horror film with frequent scares and a more linear narrative, The Exorcism may be disappointing. Its slower pace and focus on psychological drama may turn away viewers who expect something more direct. On the other hand, for those willing to immerse themselves in a story that blends the supernatural with reflections on the human condition, the film offers moments of interest, even if it does not reach its full potential. In the end, The Exorcism is a film that divides opinions. It presents interesting ideas and strong performances, but is hindered by a script that tries to embrace too many elements without fully developing them. The attempt to combine psychological horror with a character study is admirable, but the execution falls short, resulting in an experience that is both ambitious and frustrating. Still, the film may find its audience among those who appreciate more introspective stories and complex themes, even if imperfect. For others, it will be remembered as a promising attempt that failed to deliver on all its promises. However, reflecting more deeply on The Exorcism, it becomes clear that the film, despite its flaws, strives for something beyond simply creating a conventional horror narrative. It attempts to tackle universal issues such as guilt, redemption, and the devastating effects of unresolved trauma. By centering the plot around a character with a tumultuous past like Anthony's, the film subtly and complexly explores the idea of possession. What makes the film particularly intriguing, though not always effective, is how it reflects on the human psyche and the impact of our past mistakes on how we deal with the present. The concept of an exorcism intertwined with the production of a horror movie is, in theory, a powerful metaphor for how art can reflect reality while simultaneously shaping it. Anthony's struggle to cope with his addictions and childhood traumas overlaps with his preparation for the role of a priest in an exorcism film, creating a fusion of what is real and what is fiction. However, this idea, which could have been the highlight of the plot, is not fully developed. Instead of delving into the symbolism of this fusion between fiction and reality, the film leaves the viewer with more questions than answers. The film's pacing, as mentioned earlier, is another factor that undermines its impact. Rather than delivering an engaging journey of horror and mystery, the movie drags in its first half, especially when focusing on Anthony's personal struggles. The transition between the protagonist's quest for redemption and the onset of supernatural events is slow, which may alienate those expecting a more dynamic horror film. This is exacerbated by the fact that many of the supernatural events in the film are predictable, and the story's big climax is resolved in a rushed and unsatisfying manner. The attempt to critique the creative process by addressing the concept of a fictional demon becoming real is interesting but not thoroughly explored. In the end, the film leaves us with the sense that the plot got lost in its own ambition. The focus on Anthony's psychological traumas and internal battles is a bold choice, but it is not sufficiently balanced with the development of the supernatural storyline, resulting in a disjointed experience for the viewer. There is a constant tension between the pursuit of deeper meaning and the need to deliver a compelling horror story. The film fails to balance these elements, which causes the emotional impact and real fear to get lost along the way. The demon's presence, revealed as a fictional figure created for the film within the film, raises questions about the power of artistic creation, but ultimately feels like a forced and unconvincing twist. This dilutes the tension that could have been built throughout the narrative and distances the film from other examples in the genre that explore possession in a more traditional and terrifying way. One of the film's biggest shortcomings is its superficial treatment of certain characters and subplots. Lee's relationship with Blake, for example, could have been an interesting point to explore the impact of family dynamics within an emotional narrative. Instead, it is sidelined and plays no significant role in the plot's evolution. This detracts from the film's depth, which seems more focused on its twists than on truly creating a connection with the audience. Lee, as a character, could have been further developed, and her relationship with her father could have been explored more meaningfully, something that actress Samantha Mathis, with her talent, could have elevated to a more intense and captivating level. However, as mentioned, the performances are one of the positive aspects. Russell Crowe is undoubtedly the standout of the film. His portrayal of Anthony is full of nuances and conflicting emotions. He brings to the role a sense of vulnerability and fragility that humanizes the character, even as his actions begin to become unpredictable and frightening. The way Crowe confronts Anthony's internal struggle is one of the elements that keeps the viewer engaged in the story, even when other aspects of the plot begin to falter. Crowe's performance helps create an emotional bridge between the audience and the protagonist, which is essential for the film to remain relevant, even in the face of its narrative shortcomings. The cinematography also deserves recognition, as despite the film having a slower pace, the art direction and visual work contribute to the dark and oppressive atmosphere. The way light is manipulated in the more intense scenes and possession sequences is a device that helps create a visual contrast between reality and the supernatural. This works well to intensify the discomfort of the viewer, who is invited to reflect on what is happening, not only on the physical plane, but also on the psychological one. However, this visual potential is not enough to save the film from its structural issues. In the end, The Exorcism is a film that has ambition and attempts to tackle more complex issues than most conventional horror films. Its attempt to explore the psychological effects of unresolved trauma and a man's internal battle with his own demons is commendable, but the execution falls short. The combination of supernatural and psychological elements, while promising, is not entirely successful. The narrative loses itself in its own search for a deeper meaning and ends up offering an experience that, in the end, is more ambiguous than terrifying. For fans of horror films looking for something different, The Exorcism might be interesting, but for those expecting a more impactful and well-structured horror story, the film turns out to be a frustrating experience. In short, The Exorcism is an example of a film that tries to do more than it can, but fails to achieve the goal of being a truly effective psychological horror.